In the fall of 2015, I went on one of the most bizarre trips of my life. My wife was invited to give a talk in Abu Dhabi, and I got to tag along on the trip. It was this weird glimpse into the lifestyle of the 0.01%. We were only there for 3 days, but the last 2 days we got to be tourists with another couple from the Netherlands who also spoke at the event. The first day we spent mostly at the Yas Marina circuit, which hosts the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. We drag raced sports cars, did drift school, and watched races from track level. The second day, we signed up for a desert experience, which was hanging out in an oasis outside the city. For me, there was this huge feeling of deja vu. Replaced sand with snow, camels with dog sleds, and it felt oddly like home. I'd never been to the Middle East, and we were well over 10,000 kilometers away from my hometown in the subarctic of Canada, but I couldn't shake the feeling of the two places being so similar. The service sector seemed to be exclusively staffed by expats. There was an obvious government intervention in every sector of the economy. The Yas Marina circuit, which we spent the previous day at, is owned by the government of Abu Dhabi and was built by Aldar Properties, a majority state-owned real estate developer. The Grand Prix itself is sponsored by Etihad Airways, the state-owned airline, First Abu Dhabi Bank, the largest shareholder being the state, Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, which is also state-owned, and Aldar Properties, the original developer of the project. I realized that the similarities are universal in a certain type of economy, which economists call rentier states or rentier economies. Rentier economies are jurisdictions in which the economic income meets two basic criteria. The first is it relies on external sources, and the second is it does not depend on the productivity of its residents. A rentier state is simply a rentier economy with one additional criteria. The economic income goes primarily to the government. In order to understand the term rentier state, we have to use the word rent the way economists use it. The classic example of rent-seeking, according to Yale economist Robert Shiller, is that of a feudal lord who installs a chain across a river that flows through his land and then hires a collector to charge passing boats a fee to rent the river section for a few minutes. There is nothing productive about the chain or the collector. The lord has made no improvements to the river and is helping nobody in any way, directly or indirectly, except himself.
What is your favorite color? Blue. No.
So let's take a more detailed look at each of the three criteria. Rentier economies receive a large portion of their income from an external source in the form of rents. This shouldn't be confused with an economy that earns income through exporting a product or service. Take the Bahamas, for example. The Bahamian economy earns more than half of its GDP from tourism. While its tourism income is from an external source, mostly American and Canadians escaping the winter, the source of income isn't rent. The cost of going to the Bahamas on a vacation is payment for the flights, the hotels, food, drinks, activities, and the profit from the capital invested by the companies to provide those services. On the other hand, if you look at Saudi Arabia's oil industry, it sells oil at a price set by the world market, but its geology makes the cost of production much less than that of the other oil producers. Through restrictions of supply and accident of circumstance, Saudi Arabia earns $20 to $30 per barrel in additional income without providing any additional economic value. This dynamic, when rents come from resource extraction, often cause what economists refer to as the resource curse, the paradox between states that have more resource wealth being less developed and less democratic. The typical rentier economies that come to mind are the Middle Eastern petrostates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, but can include other economic circumstances like tax havens, strategic locations, and places that receive large amounts of foreign aid or remittances. A key factor in rentier economies is the number of people involved in the collection of the rent. The oil and gas industry in the Persian Gulf is capital intensive, but beyond construction provides little employment. As a result, few people are involved in the collection of rent. However, more expensive operations, like Canadian and Venezuelan oil sands, require huge capital investments to start and require a lot of ongoing labor to continue production. So all oil-producing countries are not necessarily rentier economies. Tax havens create another source of rentier income. However, almost by definition, rentier income created by allowing the global rich to avoid tax is of little benefit to the state, or even many of its residents. The British Virgin Islands is generally considered the biggest tax haven in the world. The tiny archipelago is home to about 30,000 adults, yet it hosts over 400,000 corporations, which hold an estimated $1.4 trillion in assets. In a normal economy, you'd think that would mean the average resident would own 13 corporations with an average net worth of almost $47 million. Switzerland, the wealthiest country in the world per capita, has an average net worth of about $565,000 per adult. While the BVI is among the wealthiest of the Caribbean island nations, the residents are obviously not benefiting from being 83 times richer than the average Swiss. As tax havens become more successful, their government institutions become increasingly co-opted by the finance industry and those it serves rather than its own residents, an effect that's being called the finance curse. How big of a problem is it? The BVI alone accounts for an estimated $36.5 billion in annual tax losses on the rest of the world. Yet the small registration fees that the BVI charges only earn the government $185 million per year. The BVI government actually brags on their website that these small charges make up 51% of the government revenues. So in order to collect less than the budget of a mid-sized college like, say, East Tennessee State University, taxes that amount to the entire state budget of Tennessee are forfeited.
Tennessee's governor announced the largest investment in education without a tax increase in the state's history.
Essentially, a 200-to-1 trade-off.
The governor announced his proposed $34.8 billion budget for next year.
So it's not as if the government is getting rich off the scheme. Instead, it's the global rich who are receiving the rent benefits of tax avoidance. The final criteria that moves a rentier economy to a rentier state is that the government must be the main recipient of the rentier income. For example, the proportion of the Saudi government income that comes from rental sources is 43%. Oman's is 34.5%. Qatar's is 23%. And the United Arab Emirates is 22%.
A new producing oil field means more cash for a province managing an $800 million deficit this year.
As a resource economy, it's not surprising that Canadian provincial and territorial governments have some dependence on resource income. Newfoundland and Labrador's provincial operating budget is the most dependent on revenues from resource extraction at 14.3%, followed by Saskatchewan at 12.5%, and Alberta at 9.1%. However, resource extraction isn't the only source of rents that flow to governments. Within Canada, federal government transfers to the provincial and territorial government are a form of rentier income, especially for the three northern territories. Federal government transfers make up 83% of the Yukon's operating expenses, almost 88% of the NWT's operating expenditures, and a whopping 104% of Nunavut's. While it can be argued that the federal government transfers are used to equalize the level of services across the country, another way of looking at the funding going to Canada's three northern territories is an Arctic sovereignty exercise. There is no stronger argument for the sovereignty over the North than if Canada has Canadians living and working all over the North. Many other countries have similar territories that are important for strategic reasons and therefore receive disproportionate amounts of government funding.
Gibraltar stands like a fortress, the gateway to the Mediterranean. A stubborn little piece of old England, it's one of the last bits of a British Empire that at one time controlled a quarter of the planet.
Spain has two autonomous cities that border Morocco on the mainland of Africa, Melilla and Ceuta. Malaya came to popular attention in Europe from a photo of a couple of golfers on a lush golf course with a large number of migrants sitting on a border fence in the background. In a Guardian article published in May 2017, the author summarized the Spanish city in a single sentence: Malaya's raison d'etre is defense. The article went on to describe the inequality in the economy, the reliance on government funding, the high cost of living, and the underdevelopment of the rest of the society. To anyone familiar with living in a rentier economy, whether it's a petrostate, a tax haven, or a strategic location, the description will be eerily familiar, just how Abu Dhabi seems so similar to my hometown in the subarctic of Canada. Maybe you recognize some of the effects of a rentier economy where you live, and are now asking, what can I do with that information? Being a rentier economy, or rentier state, is in itself neither good nor bad, but it does pose some specific problems and creates unique opportunities for both governments and individuals. In my next video, I will go into more detail about these problems and opportunities. Subscribe to the channel to receive a notification when that video is posted.